They thought I was just another quiet landowner who wouldn't notice when they crossed the line. But what the HOA didn't know was that I had been waiting, watching, and documenting every inch of what they were building on my property, and when the time came, I was ready to destroy them legally. So before I tell you how I turned an entire HOA upside down using their own greed, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss stories like this one, where justice doesn't just knock, kicks the door wide open. My name is Jonathan Reed, and for the last 2 years, I owned a piece of land that most people in the neighborhood had forgotten existed. It was 10 acres of unused, fenced property behind the gated community of Maple Ridge Estates. Land that once belonged to my late grandfather. I inherited it after his passing. And though I didn't plan on doing much with it immediately, I kept paying the taxes and maintaining the records. It was peaceful land, bordered by woods and a small creek, until the HOA got greedy. It started with the sound of machinery one morning. I was at the cabin my grandfather built deep inside my property line when I heard the sharp echo of drills and trucks. At first, I assumed it was the city doing work nearby, but when I followed the noise, my heart sank. There were excavators, cement trucks, and surveyors marking land that was clearly within my boundary. I stood there in disbelief as I watched construction workers lay foundations right on my soil. When I approached them, one man waved casually and said, "Hey sir, HOA is new villas. Gonna look amazing when it's done." I frowned. "You're on private property," I told him, but he shrugged. "We were told it's all part of the HOA expansion. Got the permits." That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. I drove straight to the HOA office, a sleek building near the community entrance, where I met their president. A sharp-tongued woman named Valerie Hunt. She sat behind a glass desk, perfectly composed, and when I told her what was happening, she smiled as if I were a child who didn't understand the world. "Oh, Mr. Reed, there must be some confusion," she said sweetly. "That land is part of the Maple Ridge expansion project. It's being developed for 12 new luxury villas approved by the county." I handed her a folder with my DID property maps and the survey my grandfather had done decades ago. "You're building on my land," I said coldly. "You need to stop now." Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened. "Mr. Reed, that land was annexed years ago. It's under HOA jurisdiction now. If you have concerns, you can bring them up in a board meeting." I could tell she didn't believe I'd fight her. She assumed I was ignorant or powerless. But what she didn't know was that I worked in real estate law before retiring early. I knew exactly how property boundaries, easements, and legal filings worked. Instead of arguing, I thanked her politely and left. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office, pulled all the land records, and confirmed what I already knew: no annexation had ever been filed, and the property title was still under my name, clean and absolute. The HOA had no claim whatsoever. That's when I decided to play the long game. I could have stopped them immediately with an injunction, but that would have only caused temporary chaos. I wanted them to hang themselves with their own rope. So, I stayed silent. I let them build. For months, I watched from the tree line as construction expanded foundation after foundation. Walls rising, workers sweating in the sun, and HOA board members visiting the site proudly with clipboards. They hosted meetings boasting about their upcoming luxury villas that would increase property value. Residents were excited, already putting down pre-sale deposits. They had no idea they were investing in land that didn't belong to the HOA. I recorded everything: drone footage, photographs, videos, copies of HOA newsletters where they publicly announced their new development. Every piece of evidence stacked neatly in my folder. I didn't confront anyone again, even when workers accidentally cut my fence or parked on my driveway. I smiled, waved, and kept filming. I even spoke to a few contractors casually, pretending to be curious, learning which companies were involved. They were clueless, they thought. HOA owned the land. By the 6th month, all 12 villas were complete. Beautiful 2-story homes, modern design, shining glass windows, and manicured lawns standing proudly on my property. HOA held a grand opening celebration with banners, food trucks, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I stood at a distance with my camera, quietly capturing every detail. Valerie was there, giving a speech about growth, unity, and investment. I almost laughed. She had no idea her empire was about to collapse. After the event, I called my lawyer, a close friend named Michael Green. We sat in my cabin that evening, going through every document. When he finished reviewing, he looked up with a grin. "Jonathan, this is airtight. They built 12 houses on land they don't own. Every dollar they spent is gone. You can sue them for damages, trespassing, and unlawful development. Or you can reclaim everything they're technically yours now." That last line hit me hard. The villas, worth millions in total, stood on my title. Legally, I owned every nail, every wall, every roof. I didn't need revenge. I already had victory in my hands. But we agreed to handle it the right way. No media, no dramagist court. Over the next week, we prepared the case meticulously. Photos, video proof, land surveys, drone footage, tax receipts, HOA, announcements, all lined up perfectly. When we finally filed the lawsuit, it hit the HOA like a lightning strike. They were served during one of their board meetings. Valerie's face reportedly turned white when she read the papers. I wasn't there to see it, but residents later told me she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Rumors spread fast. Homeowners panicked when they learned that the villas they'd bought weren't actually HOA property. Some had already moved in, others were in escrow, and banks started freezing loans. The local news picked up the story within days, splashing headlines like luxury HOA development built on private land. Valerie tried to reach me multiple times, calling, sending emails, even visiting my gate. I never responded. Everything had to go through the court now. As the first hearing approached, I stood outside my cabin one evening, watching the sunset behind the villas. Their lights flickered to life one by one, shining like stolen stars. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs, but soon they would lose everything they built. The first court hearing took place in early spring, and by then, the story had already turned into a storm across Maple Ridge Estates. Reporters hovered outside the courthouse, homeowners whispered at every corner, and Valerie Hunt, the once untouchable HOA president, walked in wearing dark glasses and a forced smile. I sat at the plaintiff's table, calm and collected, a thick binder of evidence in front of me. My lawyer, Michael Green, leaned over and whispered, "Just keep quiet, Jonathan. The facts will speak for themselves." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The HOA's attorneys tried to start strong, insisting there had been a clerical misunderstanding regarding boundary lines. They claimed that an old annexation document existed somewhere in the county records, conveniently misplaced. But Michael was ready for that. He stood up, laid out certified copies of the property deed, tax receipts, and an unbroken chain of ownership dating back nearly 50 years. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "there was never an annexation. The HOA acted without legal jurisdiction and knowingly built 12 full-scale residential properties. On my client's private land." Valerie shifted uncomfortably, her lawyer flipping through papers in panic. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is this true, Mrs. Hunt? Did your association verify the boundaries before construction?" She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find her words. Michael continued, showing printed photos of construction crews, HOA newsletters announcing new community villas, and the celebratory ribbon-cutting photos. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. "These homes," Michael said, pointing at the images, "were advertised, sold, and occupied all on land that belongs, without dispute, to Mr. Reed." When he finished, the HOA's legal team looked pale. Valerie tried to regain control, saying, "We were told by our previous surveyor that the land fell under HOA jurisdiction. We acted in good faith." But the judge wasn't impressed. "Good faith doesn't authorize you to seize private property," he said sternly. "This is serious misconduct." The hearing ended with the judge ordering a full property survey by an independent firm. I knew the outcome would confirm everything I claimed. Over the next few weeks, tension ran high. Residents of Maple Ridge were furious. Many had already paid deposits or purchased the villas through HOA channels. When the truth came out that the land wasn't even HOA owned, panic spread like wildfire. Banks froze mortgage processes, insurance companies withdrew coverage, and realtors backed out of sales. Some homeowners confronted Valerie directly during board meetings, demanding refunds and answers. Videos leaked online showing shouting matches, tears, and people threatening lawsuits. The once pristine image of Maple Ridge Estates shattered overnight. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, sticking to my routine. Every morning I'd walk near the villas, noticing how the lawns were now drying out. The contractors had stopped coming, and the for sale signs were taken down. The community looked ghostly, frozen in uncertainty. One day, as I was inspecting the property line with my camera, Valerie showed up unexpectedly. She got out of her car, her face tight with frustration, and approached me cautiously. "Mr. Reed," she began, "we both know this has gone too far. There must be a way to settle this without destroying everyone involved." I stared at her for a moment, measuring my response. "You built 12 homes on my land, Mrs. Hunt," I said quietly. "You ignored me when I showed you proof. Now you want mercy?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, I admit mistakes were made, but we can work something out. The HOA can buy the land from you at market value. We can fix this." I smiled faintly. "Market value?" I asked. "Do you even realize what these villas are worth now? You've developed them on my property without my consent. Legally, everything built here belongs to me." Her expression froze. "That's absurd," she snapped. "You can't just take 12 homes." "I didn't take them," I said calmly. "You built them for me." She turned red, her voice trembling. "If you don't cooperate, you'll ruin dozens of families. People already bought these homes." I stepped closer and said, "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to play real estate queen." She stormed off, muttering something about bringing new evidence. But I knew she was bluffing. Within days, the court-appointed survey team arrived, equipped with GPS scanners, drones, and measuring equipment. They spent 3 full days mapping every inch of the area. I stood nearby, quietly watching while Valerie tried to act confident, but I could tell she was terrified. When the final report came back, the results were undeniable. Every single villa, every driveway, every garden was entirely within my property boundary. Not even a corner touched HOA land. Michael submitted the survey to the court, and the judge set a date for final ruling. Word spread fast. Residents began moving out, some abandoning homes mid-furnishing. A few even tried to contact me directly, begging for leniency. One couple, the Parkers, visited my cabin tearfully. They explained they had sold their previous house to buy one of the villas, trusting the HOA completely. I felt bad for them. They were victims too. "We don't blame you," Mrs. Parker said softly. "We just don't know where to go now." I reassured them that my intention wasn't to evict innocent families. "I'm after the HOA, not you," I told them. "Once this is over, we'll find a way to resolve it." The next week, Valerie tried one last desperate move. Her lawyers filed a motion to stall the case, claiming public interest and potential economic disruption. But the judge denied it immediately. "You built illegally," he said sharply. "You had ample opportunity to verify ownership." The final hearing was set for mid-April. By then, the media had turned the case into a spectacle. Headlines read, "HOA empire built on stolen land and property owner outsmarts greedy board." Even local TV channels ran nightly updates. Michael advised me to stay off camera, and I did, letting the evidence speak for itself. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed. Valerie looked exhausted, her reputation shattered. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The proceedings lasted 2 hours, but it was clear from the beginning how it would end. The judge reviewed the survey results, the deed history, and the HOA's own public announcements. Then he leaned back and said, "This court finds that the 12 residential properties in question were constructed entirely on private land owned by Mr. Jonathan Reed. The Maple Ridge HOA acted without legal authority and is hereby liable for damages, costs, and full transfer of ownership rights to the plaintiff." There was a murmur across the room. Valerie's face went blank, and her lawyers immediately began whispering frantically, probably discussing appeals. But it was over. The gavel came down, and just like that, everything the HOA built, the 12 luxury villas, the paved roads, the landscaping, was legally mine. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones and cameras surrounded us, but I simply said, all I ever wanted was respect for my rights. They took my land. Now it's time they face the consequences. Over the following weeks, the fallout was brutal. The HOA board resigned one by one. Valerie tried to vanish quietly. But the homeowners weren't done with her. They filed a class action lawsuit accusing her of fraud and negligence. Her once pristine social image crumbled, and word spread that she sold her house and left the state. Meanwhile, I began managing the villas. Since they were now legally mine, I decided to rent them out rather than sell. The income was enough to change my life completely. Contractors returned to finish minor work, this time under my supervision. I walked through each house, inspecting the craftsmanship that was once meant to represent HOA pride. Ironically, they had done an excellent job: top quality, modern finishes, designer fixtures. I almost laughed thinking about how Valerie's arrogance had gifted me millions. Yet deep down, I wasn't driven by greed. It was about justice. They had assumed I was weak, unimportant, easy to ignore. Now they knew better. As I stood on the balcony of one of the villas one evening, watching the sunset over the land my grandfather had cherished, I felt both vindicated and nostalgic. The fight was over, but a part of me still couldn't believe it had gone that far. I had outsmarted a system that prided itself on control, and I did it by simply waiting for them to destroy themselves. Even after winning the court case, peace didn't return as quickly as I had imagined. For weeks, the HOA's collapse left Maple Ridge Estates in chaos. Mailboxes overflowed, community pools closed, and lawns went untrimmed. The neighborhood that once bragged about its perfection now looked deserted, with for sale signs popping up like weeds. The remaining residents didn't know who to trust, and some even avoided eye contact when I walked past. I became both a symbol of justice and a reminder of what their blind loyalty had cost them. One afternoon, I was reviewing the rental agreements for the villas when I received an unexpected visit. A black sedan stopped in front of my property, and a man in a gray suit stepped out. He introduced himself as Mark Halstead, a regional developer and investor. "Mr. Reed," he said, extending his hand confidently, "I've been following your case closely. What happened? Here it's remarkable. You turned a legal nightmare into an opportunity." "Depends what kind of opportunity you're talking about," I replied. He smiled. "You now own 12 newly built villas in one of the most desirable districts in the county. My firm could partner with you to turn this into a luxury retreat. Short-term rentals, events, private villas for executives. We handle everything, you just collect profit." The offer sounded tempting, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, slick. I told him I'd think about it and watched him drive away. That night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. The victory had brought money and attention, but also people who wanted a piece of it. The next morning, I found out Valerie Hunt had filed an appeal not to reverse the ownership, but to delay compensation payments. According to court documents, she was claiming bankruptcy. That meant collecting damages from the HOA would take months, maybe years. My lawyer said, "You'll get the villas, but not the cash anytime soon." The board drained their reserves before resigning. I sighed. They built 12 homes illegally, and now they claim they're broke. Michael nodded. "It's a classic move. They probably moved money around right before the ruling." The realization made me angry, not because I needed the money, but because of their audacity. They had spent years pretending to be guardians of community values, yet behind the scenes, they were nothing but opportunists. Still, I kept my composure and focused on making the villas operational. I hired a small team to inspect utilities, water lines, and electrical systems. During one of those inspections, a worker found something odd beneath one of the villa's, an old steel box buried near the foundation. Inside were sealed documents, blueprints, property contracts, and handwritten notes signed by Valerie herself. When I read them, my blood ran cold. They showed that Valerie had known from the beginning that the land wasn't HOA property. The documents even included an email exchange where she told a contractor, "Just keep this quiet. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll have enough signatures to push annexation through." It was undeniable proof of premeditated fraud. I immediately handed the documents over to my lawyer, who promised to forward them to the state attorney's office. Within a week, Valerie was summoned for questioning. The news hit local headlines again. HOA president under investigation for fraud and misappropriation. The story exploded across social media, and this time, there was no sympathy left for her. I thought that would finally bring closure, but trouble wasn't done with me yet. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my house. Grabbing my flashlight, I went out onto the porch and saw two figures near the villa's construction site. When I called out, they bolted into the trees. I found tire tracks and broken glass near the edge of my land, but no sign of who they were. Michael later suggested it could be angry former homeowners or people trying to steal equipment left behind by the HOA. I started installing cameras and motion sensors around the property just to be safe. The next week, Mark Halstead returned with another offer, this time more aggressive. He walked into my office unannounced and said, "Jonathan, let's be honest. Managing these villas yourself is a headache. Sell them to us, take the profit, and move on." I studied his expression. "Why are you so interested in this property?" He chuckled. "Because it's valuable. And because everyone knows you didn't build those villas, you just won them. They're like unclaimed gold. You're sitting on millions." "They're mine," I said simply. "Legally and morally." His smile faded. "Then don't be surprised if someone comes for them the hard way." That line stuck with me. It was both a warning and a threat. After he left, I began to wonder who really sent him. A few days later, my lawyer confirmed that the HOA's former treasurer, a man named Henry Clay, had ties to Halstead's company. It all began to make sense. They were trying to buy back the development through shell companies to erase the HOA's mistake. I wasn't going to let that happen. Over the next month, I began transferring management of the villas to a legitimate property firm, ensuring everything was in my name alone. We rebranded the site as the Ridge Villas, promoting it as a peaceful getaway surrounded by nature. Bookings started pouring in faster than I expected. The project was profitable, but I kept a low profile, avoiding interviews and media appearances. Yet the chaos surrounding the old HOA wasn't done spreading. Former residents of Maple Ridge began suing each other over shared maintenance contracts and property liens. Some claimed they were emotionally traumatized by the scandal. The county had to step in and dissolve the HOA entirely, appointing a temporary administrative board just to handle ongoing disputes. Valerie's trial date was set for later that year, and from what I heard, she had no defense left. One evening, I got a call from Mrs. Parker, one of the few decent families from the villas. "Jonathan," she said, "there's a group meeting at the old clubhouse. Some people are saying you manipulated the HOA into building those houses on purpose. Is that true?" "Who's saying that?" "Just some of the former board members," she said. "They think you knew what would happen, that you set them up." I laughed bitterly. "They destroyed themselves, Mrs. Parker. I just didn't stop them." She hesitated before replying, "I believe you. But be careful. Some people are angry they lost everything." After that, I made it a point not to attend any public events in town. Still, the rumors spread. People said I had planned it all, that I tricked the HOA by staying silent until construction finished. It was nonsense, but it made for good gossip. One local blogger even called me the man who turned revenge into real estate. It wasn't the reputation I wanted, but at least it was the truth that kept me safe. A month later, I received a court notice someone had filed a counterclaim against me, arguing that I had unjustly benefited from the HOA's development. The claim was weak, clearly the work of desperate former members trying to salvage something. Michael laughed when he read it. "They're just grasping at straws," he said. "We'll crush this Isley." And we did. The court dismissed the claim within minutes, calling it baseless and retaliatory. Still, the experience reminded me how quickly people could turn from victims into accusers. Even though I had done nothing wrong, I was now painted as a cunning strategist who had played everyone. As the months went on, the story of Maple Ridge faded from the headlines. Valerie's arrest made one last splash when she was sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud and falsifying public documents. Seeing her mugshot on TV gave me no satisfaction, just a sense of finality. I wasn't angry anymore. I just wanted my peace back. By late summer, the Ridge villas were fully booked. And for the first time in a long while, I felt proud not of the chaos that led me there, but of what I had built from it. One quiet evening, as I stood outside watching the lights of the villas glow in the twilight, I realized how far things had come. What began as betrayal had turned into victory, but even victories carry weight. The land had always been mine, but now it carried stories of greed, arrogance, justice, and resilience. And though I had one, I knew deep down that power always invites envy. Somewhere out there, someone was still plotting to take what wasn't theirs again, and I'd be ready when they tried. The months following the court victory should have been the calm after the storm. But instead, they became the start of something darker. While the Ridge villas prospered and new tenants moved in, strange things began happening around the property. At first, it was small equipment left out by workers would disappear overnight, or construction signs would be found bent or torn down. Then one morning, I arrived to find graffiti sprayed across one of the villa walls that read, "Thief in Disguise." My stomach twisted. It wasn't hard to guess who was behind it, the angry remnants of the HOA or the few homeowners who'd lost everything after the ruling. I reported it to the sheriff's office, but the deputy only shrugged, saying, "We'll keep an eye out, Mr. Reed. But these things usually fade once folks cool off." Still, I didn't trust cooling off to fix what was clearly a growing resentment. The next few nights, I patrolled the property myself, flashlight in hand, every noise in the woods making my heart pound. I caught no one, but one evening, I did find fresh boot prints near the tool shed and a broken lock. It was clear someone had been there deliberately. I decided to install motion lights and cameras everywhere, connecting them to my phone. But even that didn't stop what came next. 2 weeks later, one of the villas suddenly lost power in the middle of the night. The tenants, a retired couple, called me in panic because they smelled smoke. When I arrived, I found that the power box had been tampered with, wires deliberately cut and rerouted to cause a short. Thankfully, the damage was contained before it spread, but it was no accident. Someone wanted to scare me. I called Michael the next morning to tell him about it, and his tone shifted immediately. "Jonathan," he said, "I think this is bigger than some bitter homeowners. You humiliated powerful people. Developers, board members, maybe even contractors with deep pockets. Don't underestimate how far they'll go to undo you." He was right. That afternoon, I received a thick envelope in the mail no return address. Inside were printed photographs of my house, my truck, and even one of me walking my dog at night. A note on the back of one photo read, "You took everything from us. Now we take it back." My hands trembled as I showed the letter to the sheriff's office, but again, they said without fingerprints or witnesses, they couldn't do much. I realized then that I was on my own. To protect myself and my tenants, I hired a private security company. The guards started regular patrols at night, but even their presence didn't ease my nerves. The Ridge had gone from being a dream project to a fortress. One evening, while reviewing security footage, I noticed something odd. One of the cameras near the old HOA boundary caught headlights coming and going repeatedly between midnight and 3 a.m. The vehicles were different each night, but the pattern was identical. I decided to confront it myself. On a foggy Thursday night, I parked near the entrance, lights off, and waited. Around 1:40 a.m., a truck approached slowly, its headlights dimmed. It stopped by the old HOA sign, and 2 men got out carrying something heavy. I stepped out and shouted, "Hey! Who's there?" They froze for half a second before dropping what they held and sprinting into the woods. When I reached the spot, I found a plastic container full of what looked like cement mix-sand, metal rods shaped like spikes. It didn't take long to realize what it was for. Sabotage. They had been planning to damage the villa foundations or drive stakes into the plumbing. That was when I finally snapped. I called Michael the next morning and told him, "I'm done reacting. It's time to fight back," he agreed. We started documenting everything: photos, logs, security reports, police calls everything that showed harassment and intimidation. At the same time, we filed a restraining order against the dissolved HOA entity and its former board members. It might have been symbolic, but it was a warning. I was ready for war if they wanted one. Things were quiet for a few weeks after that. The rentals continued to perform well, and tenants appreciated the extra security. But peace didn't last long. Late one afternoon, I received a call from one of the construction workers I'd hired months ago to inspect the villas. "Mr. Reed," he said nervously, "I was approached by someone offering money to give them access to your blueprints. They wanted to know where your main power lines and water systems run." My blood went cold. "Who was it?" I asked. "A man in a gray suit. Said he worked for a real estate group. I didn't give him anything, but he knew my name. He even knew where my kids go to school." That detail made my jaw clench. The gray suit. It had to be Mark Halstead again. The man who had tried to buy me out now seemed to be escalating. I called Michael immediately, and he started digging into Halstead's company. Within days, he discovered that Halstead's firm had been quietly buying up properties around Maple Ridge, targeting foreclosed homes and vacant lots. The picture became clear. They were trying to reclaim the land piece by piece, surrounding my villas until I'd have no choice but to sell. It was corporate revenge, slow and deliberate. But I wasn't about to let them succeed. Instead, I decided to strike first. I called a meeting with my tenants and the few neighbors who still lived nearby. I explained what had happened and promised full protection for anyone who stayed. Some were nervous, but most stood by me. "You fought them once," said Mr. Parker, "and you won. We're not letting them bully you again." That gave me strength. Over the next month, we tightened our defenses even more. New gates were installed, private patrols expanded, and I made sure every tenant had my number on speed dial. Then one morning, I received a call from Michael that changed everything. "Jonathan, listen carefully," he said. "We found something big. Halstead's development firm is under federal investigation for fraud and racketeering. They've been using shell companies to manipulate land titles across multiple states." My pulse quickened. "Are you saying they might have done the same thing here?" "Worse," he said. "They might have funded the HOA's expansion plans in the first place." Valerie wasn't working alone. She was working for them. It hit me like a sledgehammer. The pieces suddenly made sense. The rushed construction, the overconfidence, the money that seemed endless. Valerie was just a pawn. Halstead had orchestrated the whole thing from behind the scenes, using the HOA to build luxury properties on land he didn't own, and when it blew up, he tried to buy his way back in. The realization made me furious. "Can we prove it?" I asked. Michael sighed. "Maybe we'll need financial records, emails, contractor payments. If we can trace money from Halstead's company to the HOA's accounts, we can bury them." I told him to do whatever it took. Over the next few weeks, he worked day and night, filing subpoenas and chasing leads. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even with security around, I'd catch glimpses of cars parked too long on the roadside, or people pretending to jog while glancing at my house. The paranoia was constant. One night, as I sat alone in my living room going through invoices, I heard a loud crash outside. When I rushed out, I saw flames engulfing one of the tool sheds. I grabbed the extinguisher and ran, shouting for help. By the time we put it out, the damage was done, half the shed was gone, and nearby trees were scorched. The fire inspector later confirmed what I already knew. It was arson. The accelerant was commercial-grade fuel, not something found around construction sites. I knew then that Halstead had crossed the line from intimidation to outright crime. I called Michael again and told him, "Whatever you're doing, do it faster. This isn't just business anymore. It's personal." He promised results soon, but until then, I barely slept. The Ridge Villas, once a place of pride, now felt like a battlefield. Every night, I'd stare out into the darkness, wondering when the next attack would come and if it would be worse. Still, I refused to run. I had fought for this land, for my family's legacy, and I wasn't about to let greed or fear take it away again. If Halstead wanted a war, then he was going to get one, and this time I wasn't the only one ready to fight. Mark had spent the entire weekend preparing his exhibits. scanning every document, printing color-coded maps, and even labeling photos that proved the villa sat squarely on his parcel. He didn't sleep much. Adrenaline and disbelief kept him wide awake, fueled by the thought that an entire HOA board thought they could just take what they wanted and get away with it. On Monday morning, he stood outside the county courthouse, wearing his uniform blazer, not the police one, but the one he wore during his earlier years as a county land assessor. He wanted to remind them he wasn't some clueless homeowner. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with curiosity. Local reporters filled the benches, having picked up the story after someone leaked that an HOA had allegedly built multi-million-dollar homes on land they didn't own. Karen and the HOA members entered, dressed in polished suits, smug and whispering among themselves. Karen met Mark's eyes briefly, her expression confident and almost taunting. The judge called the room to order, and the battle officially began. The HOA's attorney, a sharp man named Jonathan Briggs, started with an opening argument that made it sound as though Mark was the one in the wrong. He claimed Mark had abandoned the land for years, never maintained it, and that the HOA had every right to incorporate it into their expansion plan under adverse possession. Mark sat still, watching the show unfold, letting the attorney dig himself deeper. When it was his turn, he stood calm and composed, and handed the judge a thick binder labeled Property Ownership and Boundary Records. 1972, present. As the judge flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. Every deed, every zoning map, every tax payment history, all under Mark's name. Then came the aerial drone images he'd collected. Clear, time-stamped shots of construction crews tearing into his property months before any notice was sent. The HOA attorney shifted uncomfortably, his confident tone starting to crack. Karen fidgeted in her chair, her face pale now. The judge looked up, asking, "Did your HOA seek or obtain permission from Mr. Taylor to build on this land?" The silence that followed was brutal. Jonathan cleared his throat and mumbled something about assumed consent. The courtroom murmured, and Mark took that moment to lean forward slightly, saying, "Your Honor, they didn't assume consent. They ignored ownership, they ignored boundaries, and they ignored the law." The hearing continued for hours, as Mark presented evidence, piece by piece. There were the surveyor reports that clearly outlined his boundary lines, the construction permits filed under false property descriptions, and even emails between Karen and a local developer that hinted they knew they were building outside HOA limits. The judge read the emails aloud, and gasps spread through the courtroom when Karen's words appeared. "It's fine. No one's using that land, and if anyone questions it, we'll claim it's part of the community reserve." Mark stood quietly, while the HOA's confidence evaporated. Karen tried to intervene, claiming the emails were taken out of context, but the damage was done. The judge announced a short recess, and as everyone stepped out into the hallway, Karen rushed toward Mark. "You're making a mistake, Mark. This doesn't have to go public," she hissed under her breath. "We can make a deal, maybe one of the villas, or a large payout. You don't need to destroy everything." Mark's jaw tightened. "You already did that when you built on land that wasn't yours," he said coldly. "Now you'll learn what real accountability feels like." He turned away before she could respond, walking back toward the bench with renewed focus. When court resumed, the judge called forward the county property registrar, who confirmed under oath that the land was legally registered under Mark's name and had never been transferred, sold, or leased. The HOA's last defense claiming administrative error collapsed right there. By the end of the day, the judge announced an injunction. All construction activities were to cease immediately, and a full restitution hearing would be scheduled within the week. The next morning, headlines filled every local news outlet. HOA faces lawsuit for building on private property. 12 villas at risk of demolition after shocking ownership revelation. TV reporters gathered near the gated entrance of the neighborhood, waiting for statements from both sides. Mark stayed quiet, following his lawyer's advice, but his silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, inside the HOA boardroom, panic spread. Homeowners demanded answers. People who had invested in the new villas started calling attorneys, terrified that their dream homes sat on stolen land. Karen called an emergency meeting, but this time, her leadership shattered. Board members shouted over one another, arguing about who was responsible, who signed what, and why no one verified the property boundaries. Some turned on Karen directly, accusing her of pushing the project through without proper checks. She tried to deflect, saying Mark's boundaries were confusing, but no one believed her. Mark's lawyer sent a formal notice of damages, including the cost of land misuse, emotional distress, and construction impact on his property value. The numbers shocked them millions of dollars. Days passed, and things only got worse for the HOA. Inspectors showed up, red-tagging villas that stood partially completed, and construction halted entirely. Investors began withdrawing, lawsuits multiplied, and Karen's name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Mark watched all of this unfold from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with grim clarity. He hadn't wanted to destroy anyone's home, but justice needed to mean something. When he visited the site weeks later under court supervision, the one-sprout villas now looked abandoned and finished walls, exposed beams, weeds growing through concrete. He walked among them quietly, remembering how that same land used to be peaceful and untouched before the HOA's bulldozers arrived. One of the construction foremen approached him, recognizing who he was. "You're the owner, right?" the man asked softly. Mark nodded. "We just did what we were told," the foreman said. "We thought everything was cleared. I'm sorry." Mark didn't reply, only giving a small nod before leaving. Back in town, Karen's reputation was in ruins. The news had picked up her emails, her arrogance, her attempts to bribe Mark for silence, and now she was being investigated for fraud. The HOA board dissolved under pressure. Homeowners resigned, and chaos replaced the once pristine suburban image. Yet, despite his legal win, Mark felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. The land he had cherished was now scarred by greed and destruction. The victory was his, but so was the wreckage. He drove home under a cloudy sky, the sound of distant thunder echoing across the valley. A reminder that actions have consequences, and that sometimes justice feels both powerful and painfully hollow. Weeks turned into months as the lawsuit progressed, and what started as a quiet property dispute had turned into a full-blown media spectacle. Mark became an unwilling local celebrity, the man who outsmarted an entire empire. He couldn't step into a grocery store without someone stopping him to shake his hand or whisper, "Good for you, man." Someone needed to take them down. But behind that calm composure, Mark was exhausted. He was attending court dates, dealing with lawyers, engineers, and inspectors, all while watching the place he once loved rot away into a construction graveyard. The county had frozen the HOA's accounts pending judgment, and most of the contractors had walked off-site, leaving half-finished villas baking under the sun. One morning, he got a call from his lawyer, telling him that the HOA had filed a counterclaim, accusing him of unreasonable obstruction and defamation. Mark laughed bitterly when he heard it. "They're trying to sue me for telling the truth?" he said. His lawyer, a steady, gray-haired man named Douglas, sighed. "That's how desperate they are. They're hoping to muddy the waters, but don't worry, we've got them cornered." When Mark arrived at the next hearing, the courthouse was packed again. Reporters lined the hallway, cameras flashing as he walked in. Inside, Karen looked like a shadow of her former self, her hair unkempt, her expression tight, her once bright confidence gone. But when she saw Mark, she still tried to smirk, as if clinging to some remnant of power. The HOA's new attorney took the stand, claiming the land issue was a mutual misunderstanding and that the HOA had acted in good faith. Mark's lawyer stood, holding a fresh folder. "Your Honor, we have proof the HOA continued building even after being served with notice of ownership and attempted to file a fraudulent quitclaim deed." The courtroom gasped. Douglas passed copies of the document around, showing clear evidence that Karen and two board members had tried to reassign Mark's property using falsified signatures. Karen's face went white. The judge slammed the gavel. "That's not a misunderstanding," the judge said firmly. "That's fraud." The mood in the room shifted entirely. What had been a battle of words now turned into a criminal investigation. The judge ordered an immediate review of the HOA's financial records and the involvement of law enforcement to determine the extent of fraud. Karen's lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. Within a week, detectives were combing through the HOA's offices, seizing computers, ledgers, and personal devices. News outlets went wild with the coverage headlines like HOA scandal deepens, fraud and forgery. Found in property case filled every paper in town. Mark, though vindicated, still felt no joy in watching the chaos unfold. He met with Douglas one evening in his quiet farmhouse, and the lawyer said, this could take them down completely. You might not just get your land back, you could own the whole development once the court rules damages. Mark stared at his old coffee mug, half filled, and said quietly, I never wanted to own more. I just wanted to protect what was mine. Douglas smiled slightly. That's what makes you different from them. Meanwhile, Karen's life began unraveling faster than she could control. Homeowners turned against her, her personal assets were frozen, and she became the centerpiece of a county-wide scandal. The once powerful HOA leader was now seen walking out of court in handcuffs for an arraignment, on charges of fraud and falsification of documents. Cameras followed her every move as she tried to hide her face. Mark watched the news silently, not gloating, just observing how greed could bring down even the most arrogant. But while the legal case moved toward its conclusion, another unexpected twist surfaced. One of the developers who had funded the villas came forward with his own lawsuit against the HOA, the county zoning board, and Mark himself. His lawyers argued that since Mark's land was now under dispute, his entire investment had been compromised. They're trying to drag me into another fight, Mark muttered, rubbing his temples. Douglas assured him it was a stalling tactic, a way to delay the inevitable payout. Still, the pressure mounted. News vans parked near his property daily, neighbors sent letters of support, and online commentators debated whether Mark should have stopped construction earlier, or if letting it finish was his masterstroke. He barely slept. Some nights, he'd walk down to the edge of his field, where the villas stood silhouetted against the moonlight, eerily silent and empty. He remembered how peaceful it had been before all this, before the HOA turned his land into a war zone of greed. One evening as he stood there, a pickup truck pulled up beside him. It was Tom, one of the original contractors who had worked on the villas. I heard what's happening, Tom said, stepping out, his face weathered. You did the right thing. Those people thought they owned the world. But I gotta tell you something, they didn't just build on your land. They used cheap materials, cut corners, ignored safety codes. Those homes wouldn't have lasted 5 years even if this hadn't happened. Mark nodded slowly, realizing just how reckless the entire project had been. Thanks for telling me, he said. Tom hesitated, then added, you might want to check the foundations sometime. They poured some of those slabs on wet soil to save time. When the rains come, he trailed off, shaking his head. Mark felt a chill. The next morning, he called in an independent structural inspector who confirmed Tom's warning the villas were unstable. When the next court date arrived, Mark's team presented this new report, showing that the villas weren't just illegally built, they were dangerously constructed. The judge ordered an emergency safety review and temporarily condemned the buildings till a full engineering assessment could be done. That news hit the HOA like a death blow. Property values crashed overnight, insurance companies pulled out, and panicked homeowners began fleeing the community. The beautiful neighborhood that once symbolized wealth and order was now a ghost town of half-finished homes and for-sale signs. Mark watched it all from his porch, the morning sun glinting off the rooftops that weren't even supposed to exist. His lawyer called him later that day to inform him that the court had finalized ownership rulings. His deed stood untouched. Legally confirmed, and every structure built on his land was now under his control. He could demolish, sell, or repurpose them as he pleased. The irony was sharp. The HOA had tried to take his land, and now everything they'd built on it belonged to him. Mark visited the site one last time that evening, standing among the empty villas, their windows reflecting the fading light. For the first time in months, he let himself smile. Justice had taken time, patience, and sleepless nights, but it had arrived quietly, powerfully, and inescapably. The final court ruling came on a bright Monday morning, the kind of morning that felt heavy with fate. Mark stood quietly in the courtroom as the judge read the decision, his hands folded, his heart steady. The room was packed again, reporters, homeowners, former HOA members, and even a few curious townspeople who'd followed the saga since day one. In light of overwhelming evidence, the judge said, his voice clear, "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Mark Taylor. The property in question legally belongs to him, and the structures built upon it are declared his lawful assets. The Homeowners Association is hereby ordered to pay full restitution for land misuse, legal expenses, and damages. Furthermore, the board members, including Ms. Karen Whitfield, are found guilty of fraud and property misrepresentation." The gavel struck once, echoing like thunder in the room. Karen let out a sharp breath, her face ghostly pale. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, not out of triumph, but out of release. The long storm was finally ending. As he stepped outside, flashes from cameras burst around him. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones reached for his face, but he just said calmly, "I didn't win because I wanted revenge. I won because I refused to let greed bury the truth." Those words ran in headlines across the state that night, solidifying his name not as a victim, but as a symbol of standing firm against power gone wrong. Days later, Mark walked his land at sunrise, the same place where the chaos had begun. The villas stood eerily silent, empty shells of arrogance and deceit, their luxury unfinished and abandoned. The early light touched the cracked driveways and overgrown lawns, reminding him that no matter how much money or influence someone had, nature and truth always outlasted corruption. County workers had put up signs marking each property for demolition, though Mark hadn't yet decided what to do. Douglas, his lawyer, stopped by that morning with a smile. "It's all officially over," he said, handing Mark a final folder. The title deed stamped by the court and the check from the HOA's restitution fund. "You could rebuild, sell, turn it into something new. You've earned it." Mark looked across the field of ghostly houses and said quietly, "Maybe I'll rebuild something honest here. Something that reminds people that ownership means responsibility."
Out.
Douglas chuckled softly. "That's not a bad idea. Just don't call it an HOA." Mark laughed for the first time in months. Later, he stood near the largest of the villas, his boots crunching the gravel. He thought of all the months of lies, threats, and legal battles that had led to this quiet morning. He thought of Karen, who was now serving community service hours after her conviction, sweeping courthouse steps where she once barked orders at others. He didn't feel hatred toward her anymore, just pity. Her obsession with control had cost her everything. The HOA was dissolved, the community disbanded, and even the remaining residents had voted to strip the neighborhood of its association entirely. Freedom had finally returned to the people, though it came at a steep price. Over the next few weeks, Mark began working with a small construction crew not to rebuild the villas, but to clear them. He sold off usable materials, recycled what he could, and let the land breathe again. Slowly, the sound of demolition echoed across the valley, but it didn't sound like destruction this time. It sounded like closure. Each crash of falling concrete, each gust of dust, carried away pieces of a painful memory. Local news covered it as the day greed fell. One afternoon, as the last of the structures came down, Mark climbed a small rise overlooking his property. The wind swept across the open field, carrying the scent of earth and rain. The land was his again, free, unchained, and quiet. He decided to rebuild not a development, but a retreat, an open community garden and nature preserve, something everyone could enjoy. He named it Whitestone Meadows, not after Karen's downfall, but as a symbol that even after betrayal, something pure could grow. As the project took shape, people began visiting families, school kids, neighbors. They all knew the story, but to them, Mark wasn't a man who sued an HOA. He was the man who taught them that patience, evidence, and truth could defeat even the most powerful lies. Months passed, and the seasons turned. Where concrete and arrogance once stood, green grass now swayed. The new garden bloomed. Benches lined the paths, and the air filled with laughter instead of arguments. The county even honored Mark with a civic award for his contribution to land rights and community reform. He gave a short speech, saying, "The land we stand on isn't just property. It's a promise, one that we keep when we protect it with honesty." The crowd applauded, some even tearing up. Later that night, as the garden lights glowed softly under the stars, Mark sat on a wooden bench overlooking the field. He thought of everything that had happened, the deceit, the lawsuits. the long nights of doubt, and realized that the battle had changed him. He no longer measured victory by winning in court, but by the peace that came afterward. Karen had vanished from the public eye after serving her sentence, reportedly moving away to start over. Some said she'd finally learned humility. Others said she was planning another community elsewhere. Mark didn't care either way. What mattered was that his land was safe, and the lesson would remain long after the headlines faded. One evening, a journalist who had followed the story from the beginning visited him for a final interview. She asked, "If you could go back, would you still let them build?" Mark smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "because sometimes the only way to expose corruption is to let it reveal itself." They built their own downfall, one brick at a time. I just watched the truth take shape. The journalist nodded thoughtfully. "What do you want people to take from your story?" Mark looked across the meadow, the sun setting behind the hills. That justice doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be patient. That line became the article's closing quote, printed in bold on the front page. It was shared thousands of times. And people from all over the country sent letters thanking him for standing up to a system that had bullied so many. Mark kept every one of those letters in a small wooden box inside his house. A reminder that what began as one man's fight for his land had become something much larger, a message about integrity, courage, and never letting greed rewrite what's rightfully yours. As months turned into a year, Whitestone Meadows flourished. The place became a local symbol of renewal, drawing visitors every weekend. The laughter of children echoed through the same valley that once echoed with bulldozers and arguments. Mark often sat quietly, watching the sunset, grateful that the nightmare had ended and that his land had found peace again. He'd rebuilt something worth far more than the villas ever were a legacy. The story of his fight spread across social media, inspiring homeowners across the nation to question their HOAs, to learn their rights, and to stand firm when bullied by corruption disguised as authority. And in the end, as the camera of memory panned back from the peaceful garden he'd created, the same man who once watched his land stolen now watched it reborn, quiet, free, and alive. Justice had come full circle, proving that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always reclaim what's rightfully its own. So if you ever think one voice can't make a difference, remember Mark's story, because standing your ground might just change everything. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel for more powerful real-life dramas, justice tales, and HOA revenge stories that prove karma never sleeps.